Chapter 6, March 30th, 1862. It took Cuff several hours to get across the open zone. He would wait for scattered clouds to drift over the moon, then dart from bushes to trees, trees to bushes. Twice he heard the sharp crack of a musket, but didn't know if he was the target, so he kept going. Drawing closer to the enemy lines, he watched and waited. The pickets plodded back and forth between the campfires, following a pattern. He timed himself carefully, then crouched and raced through a gap. A rebel sentry was only 60 feet away, but he never noticed the lone black slave. Inside the rim of the defenses, Cuff could relax a bit. He trudged for a while through the woods until he reached a weedy footpath. The moon was gone now, and he decided to wait until morning before moving on. Wearily, Cuff crawled under a bush, stretched out, and soon fell asleep. The yams will grow, the cotton blow, we'll have the rice and corn. Oh, never you fear, some day you'll hear, oh, Gabriel sound his horn. The sound of voices awakened Cuff. He peered through the bushes and saw some black men coming down the path. They were singing softly, carrying pans and buckets. Cuff was worried. Would the men accept him? He swallowed nervously. It was time to find out. He got up, brushed himself off, and stepped into view, wearing a sheepish grin. The slaves stopped in surprise at the sight of this small, dark stranger who had popped out of nowhere. Cuff nodded and scuffed his shoes. "Mornin'," he said. "My name Cuff. I'm lost." The men, dressed in old clothes like his own, grouped around, curious but friendly. They were taking breakfast to the sentries out on the picket lines. One of the men handed Cuff a piece of army biscuit and a tin cup of hot coffee. "We be headin' back to camp in a little while," he said. "You want to come 'long? Just wait here." Thanking him, Cuff wolfed the biscuit and coffee and sat down again. Half an hour later the slaves returned. He handed over the empty cup and fell into step with the party. There were 8 of them. No one would notice one more black face. The men shambled along silently, Cuff walking with them. They reached the outskirts of Yorktown and the rebel encampment, where they headed toward a kitchen tent and went inside. Cuff held back, unsure of himself. He stood, shuffling his feet, wondering what to do next. But before he could decide, a Confederate officer on a roan horse came trotting up. He stared at Cuff suspiciously. "Why aren't you working?" he asked. "Who do you belong to?" Cuff bobbed his head and put on a foolish smile. "Don't belong to nobody, master. I's free, far's I know. Wantin' to go to Richmond, find some work." The officer frowned. "There are no free niggers here," he growled. "Not while there's a Confederate army in Virginia." He turned and shouted to a trooper. "Sergeant, put this cheeky rascal to work and keep him at it. If he turns lazy, give him a good lesson with the lash." Spurring his horse, the officer wheeled and trotted off. The sergeant beckoned, and Cuff followed dutifully. Passing through camp, he shuffled along with eyes half closed. But under the drooping, lazy lids, the eyes stood sharp, note of everything. The vast area reminded him very much of his own encampment, except that here the soldiers were dressed in gray instead of blue. South of the city, the rebels were building defenses to hold off the Federal army. There was a long parapet over 8 feet high, and scores of slaves were at work on it. Some were digging trenches and gun pits. Others pounded double rows of stakes into the ground. A third group filled this space with mountains of rocks and gravel. The sergeant pushed a shovel at Cuff and pointed to a large wheelbarrow. Cuff's duty was to fill the barrel with gravel, push it up an inclined plank on the top of the parapet, and dump the ballast between the stakes. Even for a brawny man, it would have been hard work. For small, slim Cuff, it soon became torture. Under a hot sun, shoulders aching, Cuff filled barrel after barrel. Then he forced each load up the tilted plank. The plank was narrow and wobbly, and sometimes the heavy barrel tipped off. When that happened, he had to climb down, refill it, and start over again. The men around him worked steadily. Now and then they traded a little banter or broke into a soulful hymn, but most of the time they worked in sad silence. Noontime brought a chance to rest and eat. Cuff picked up a tin bowl and spoon and joined the long line, glad to be free of the wheelbarrow. He soon discovered that the white troopers ate well, but slave food was poor, mostly bread and gruel, with a bit of dried beef now and then. Later the work gangs went back to their drudgery. The sergeants who supervised them were harsh men. They bullied and threatened, and any slave who slowed down felt the sharp pain of a leather lash. Cuff worked as hard as he could, hoping to avoid attention, and by mid-afternoon his hands were raw and bleeding, but the sun went down at last, and work on the fortifications ended for the day. After a skimpy supper, the slaves were allowed an hour to wander around freely. Then they had to report to an area at the far end of camp. Cuff took good advantage of his free time, roaming the fort, noting the types of artillery, memorizing the layout of the trenches, tried to remember everything so he could jot it down later. At curfew hour, all the blacks were herded into a compound for the night, and Cuff saw with relief that there were no white overseers here. The slaves broke up into small groups. They sprawled under the scraps of canvas hung from branches and started fires to boil water for acorn coffee. Cuff, with his brown skin, had been accepted completely, and during the day had become friendly with some of the others. But now he needed privacy. A kind old man handed him a ragged blanket, which he took gratefully. Then he found an isolated tree, sat down, and tried to ignore his aches and pains. When all was quiet and nobody was watching, Cuff drew out his slips of paper and began to write in the dark. He listed the artillery he had seen on his walk: 25 rifled 3-inch cannons, 11 Dahlgren guns, 29 32-pounders, 7 siege howitzers, 14 heavy mortars, 13 columbiads, many light weapons. He made a rough diagram of the new earthworks, then pushed all the slips back under the lining of his shoe. Cuff was pleased. His fears had faded. His information was just what McClellan needed. He'd spend one more day here with the enemy, then figure a way, somehow, to get back to the Union lines. Lying on his blanket, Cuff suddenly thought of his color. In the gloom, he slipped the bottle of brown solution from his sack and dabbed his face and hands. Then, munching some of Mrs. Butler's apple slices, he settled down for the night. 20 yards away, a group of slaves sat hunched over a campfire. As Cuff dozed, they started singing in low, soft voices. It was the very hymn he'd heard early that morning in the woods. Quietly he sat up and crept closer to the firelight. Praise and thanks the Lord, he come to set his people free. Some may call it day of doom, for us 'tis a jubilee. The Lord who bade the Red Sea part is now as strong as then. He say one word and all the slaves will be the Lord's free men. Others joined in the chorus, their voices blending in subtle harmony. The yams will grow, the cotton blow, we'll have the rice and corn. Or never you fear, some day you'll hear, oh Gabriel sound his horn. After a while, Cuff slipped back to his blanket under the tree. He would need his rest for the day ahead. Lulled by the melodic voices, he fell asleep at last, his head filled with thoughts of work and sweat, of hope and faith, and the courage of black men.